Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulullah. Welcome to another episode of the Islam Through the Ages podcast. I'm your host, Taqib Musa, and I'm joined for a part two today on the history between Jews and Islam, or Judaism and Islam, and in fact, particularly about Jews and Muslims and how they treated each other. We did a part one of this, and actually the aim was to do this whole thing in one episode, but the conversation got so long and so interesting that we thought we'd break it up into two parts. So we're joined here by Ustad Mohammed Ahmed, and we introduced him last time as well. He's undergoing PhD studies in Asian and Middle Eastern studies. His dissertation for his PhD is on the exegesis of Imam al-Tabari, and he focuses on the representation of Medinan Jews, so he's perfect to talk about this. If you haven't listened to the last episode yet, then please listen to that first, because that kind of sets the stage for what we're going to talk about today. So it was talking about the start of Islam, the Mithaq al-Medina, or the Medina contract, the covenant between the Jewish tribes and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then we talked about the Umayyad Caliphate, etc. So we went all the way through to Andalusia. So, Assalamu alaikum, Ustad Muhammad. Thank you once again for joining us.
Walaikum assalam. More than happy. More than happy. It's good to be here again.
So I think last time we really got quite deep into it. It was really interesting, and we ended with talking about the convivencia in Andalusia, and how Islamic Spain was a very unique time, but also actually some of the accounts about it that are sometimes, especially in modern day Spain, sometimes are disputed, or people say it wasn't as good as it was. Actually, a lot of the reports about it are true, and it was a very interesting time with a lot of cross-pollination of ideas, people, etc. So that glorious period ended, and of course for Muslims we remember it as fall of Granada, or Granada, and the famous story of Boabdil, the last sultan, leaving and turning around and that kind of thing, and looking at the Alhambra. Was the convivencia actually primarily before it, or did it actually last up until the fall of the last Murid sultans?
Yeah, it lasted until Granada. So Granada was of course the last emirate to fall to the Christian north, and gradually, as the Muslims really over time fractured into what's called Tawa'if kingdoms, or Ta'ifa kingdoms in Islamic Spain. Then what happened was Muslim power was decentralized, and there were a lot of smaller kingdoms in Spain. And within those kingdoms, you had some which were a bit more, shall we say, strict with minority populations, especially with Jews. And you had others that were more open, more tolerant. But generally speaking, most of them were more tolerant, and drew on the convivencia history. But you do see, for example, the Zirids and other sort of Berber kingdoms that were involved in Al-Andalus. Some of those were sort of had a more strict interpretation of what it meant to be Jewish, or what it meant to sort of engage as a Muslim with Jews, and they did not believe that the ahad, shall we say, the covenant between Muslims and Jews that we have, that Jews are a protected population. They believed that didn't stand, but that was a very small minority, and so certain groups like the Al-Muwahhidun, the Almohads, also posited this, especially in the beginning of their reign. However, it wasn't the norm. In the norm was really for Jews to be very involved. I think last time I mentioned about Samuel ibn Naghrila, who was, for all intents and purposes, the prime minister, shall we say, the one who ran the day-to-day affairs of the state. That was in Granada. So Granada really, it does show this cross-pollination. And also when Muslims were kicked out, people sometimes forget, but Jews were also kicked out of Spain, and evicted from their homes, and suffered under the Spanish Inquisition, just as Muslims did. The only thing was Muslims was the majority population, so that's why we of course here a lot about what Muslims underwent under the Spanish Inquisition, which was quite horrific. But Jews also suffered, and it's for that reason that we have what's called Sephardi Jews, Sephardim in Hebrew. And Sephardim are those Jews who originally come from the Iberian Peninsula, but were forced to leave the Iberian Peninsula, and now they're scattered all over the world. And they went into, for example, some Middle Eastern countries like Turkey, and I also mentioned that in the previous episode. And when they went to live there, they became very much part of life. There's many in South America, there's many all over the world, really. Not to be confused with Mizrahi Jews, which Mizrahi Jews are the Jews that lived in Middle Eastern countries before. So those who are not of Spanish descent, but those of Spanish descent are Sephardi Jews. But these terms now have sort of become a little bit interchangeable, and people say there's Sephardi or Mizrahi Jews, and then there's Ashkenazi Jews, who are the European Jews. So these lines started to blur in the last sort of 50, 60 years. But for all intents and purposes, Sephardi Jews were very, very involved in, especially the Ottoman Empire, for example. Ladino became the language of these Jews, who it was essentially a mixture of Spanish and Hebrew and a couple of other languages as well. And it's still spoken today. I've met Ladino Jews in Istanbul, for example. So this is vibrant. This is alive. Yes, the population is now very, very small. Since the creation of the State of Israel, most of the populations of Jews living in Muslim countries has drastically declined, but they are still there, and it's a living history, and it exists.
So now, as we build up to, so we're going to get to the creation of the modern State of Israel, but as we go into the medieval period, and then post-medieval, and we're entering kind of Renaissance era, what is the history of anti-Semitism and the whole hating of Jews? Is it a uniquely European problem? Does it happen in other places? And in particular in Europe, when does it really start taking root? Is it the Reconquista onwards? So the Muslims and the Jews get kicked out of Spain, which is now Castilian Spain, and then is that the root of it, or does it start a lot later and then culminating in Hitler?
That's a good question. Europe, I think it's very important for us to differentiate between Christian anti-Semitism and what we might call Islamic anti-Semitism, if there is that. And just for context, Jews, there were pogroms and expulsions of Jews from many countries in Europe before the Spanish Inquisition, including England. So this is not something that is unique to Spain. This is not something that is uniquely Catholic even. This was happening throughout European history, from Russia to England to Spain. However, it's also important to just remember there is a completely different conception of Jews in Christianity to Islam. So in Christianity, it's quite straightforward in a way, because Christians believe themselves to be what's called Veres Israel, which means the true Israel, because according to Jewish theology, when the Messiah comes, the Torah is no longer valid, and the covenant no longer stands, and there's a new covenant, and the Messiah will lead the Jews to the promised land, etc., etc., etc. These became mainstream Christian beliefs. So Christianity was an in-group of Judaism. However, most Jews, of course, didn't accept Christianity, and Christians then sort of outgrew that from becoming a little sect, and it really became a religion. And after Paul, especially, you see a development of what we would call modern Christianity or Orthodox Christianity, which starts to develop.
Is Paul quite early? So Paul's definitely met Jesus?
No, Paul is later.
Okay.
So he is a couple of centuries afterwards, or 1.5 centuries after.
So he's not even a tabi.
Not a tabi'i. Yeah. So according to our or Islamic principle, shall we say, Paul experiences visions, right, where he sees Jesus and he's sort of instructed on what to do. So in that sense, you know, he's met Jesus through visions. So in that sense, he becomes a Sahabi in the Islamic parallel. However, of course, Islam doesn't accept such conceptions. Or I mean, even if one does see the ru'ya of the Prophet in a dream, it's considered haqq within Islam. But at the same time, it doesn't render one a Sahabi, right? So this is a difference. But then also it goes back to who Jesus is, right? In Christianity, Jesus is God himself, right? So if Jesus is God himself and God shows himself to a person, that person becomes a prophet. So in Christianity, Paul is basically a prophet, and the most important prophet, really, because Jesus had to come back and make himself known. Anyway, so, and Paul I mean, that this is, for all intents and purposes, very difficult to differentiate in early Christianity between a Jew and a Christian. And there were different groups that started to emerge, some more rejecting of the old covenant. And you see things like circumcision. Christians really debate, you know, whether they should circumcise, for example, and that type of thing. You know, laws, following the laws. And you see some Christians who are, you know, sort of almost militant against that, and you see others who wish to accept the laws while accepting Jesus as the Messiah. In any case, there's no law, or there's no sharia, or there's no fiqh or jurisprudence within Christianity, right? So because of that, there's no rulings on day-to-day interactions between Christians and Jews within Christianity. This is the major difference between Christian-Jewish relations and Muslim-Jewish relations. Muslim-Jewish relations are completely, from the day-to-day perspective, governed by fiqh, right? So Islamic jurisprudence. And Islamic jurisprudence is very clear, and the Quran itself is actually very clear that you can, for example, marry a Jew, you can eat food prepared by a Jew, you can, you know, engage with them in business, etc., etc., and the list goes on. And we know that also from the Sunnah. And then the Prophet Muhammad engaged with Jews up until his death. It wasn't just, you know, in his early life. You know, he mortgaged his shield with a Jew, you know, and on his deathbed. So this is, you know, we know in Islam we have a, let's say, functional, a functional scriptural, scripturally sanctioned relationship between Muslims and Jews. And when it comes to the theological conceptions of Jews, right, Islam, of course, like any other religion that would distinguish itself from another religion, finds problems with Jews and Judaism, right? The major one being that they didn't accept the Prophet Muhammad, you know, and accepting the Prophet Muhammad is one of the most basic things within Islam, or the creedal tenet, shall we say, within Islam. So, you know, for that reason, you see a lot of, shall we say, rhetoric, you know, that one might read and think as anti-Jewish, right? However, really, the difference really lies in the fact that there's a theological conception on the one hand, and there's a practical conception on the other. And they didn't really mix, you know. So the theological conception of Jews maybe includes things like tahrif, and, you know, for example, or the textual alteration of the Torah, which is an Islamic concept that, you know, blames Jews for the concepts like fitna or corruption in the land. These are all Quranic concepts that were elaborated upon in tafsir and in other genres of literature that linked Jews to certain, shall we say, behavioral or bad behavior, you know, if you boil it down, really. However, when it comes to day-to-day relations, Muslim-Jewish relations have always been sanctioned from the very beginning of Islam to be functional, to be positive, and just to be normal, you know. And whereas in Christianity it's very different, because there's no jurisprudence in the way that there is in Islam and Judaism, for example. Then oftentimes, let's say a ruler may be more influenced by his emotion regarding, you know, concepts like Jews being Christ killers, you know, that type of concept could then evoke a very emotional response. And that's why things like pogroms and expulsions and even Holocaust happened in the Christian world, and they never really happened in the Muslim world. If they did happen in the Muslim world, it's because a ruler misunderstood Islamic law, and that was much rarer than it was in Christendom.
So there wasn't really tradition, almost, because it was essentially a mob culture, and there was a lot of sustained language and things like that that were produced in Christian Europe, anti-Jews. So I think you talked about actually before Reconquista as well, they happened and then they carried on throughout. And then when does the almost anti-Semitic movement take root, which we then see in the 20th century, which is very, very powerful, and then actually it culminates in the Nazi Holocaust.
Yeah, so really it's with so there's two movements that start really in Europe. One is, like you say, a sort of more right-wing Christian approach, and the other is Zionism, right? And these two are sort of blooming in tandem, shall we say. And what happens is, so Zionism is a political ideology that was really in the beginning quite a secular ideology, actually, but sought political gain, sought real sort of concessions, shall we say, and based on what was developing within Europe, and this, like you say, this is a modern thing. This is 19th, 20th century. It starts to develop in Europe. You start to see a lot of accusations against Jews. Some of them are based in the folkloric tradition, so things like ritual murder, cannibalism, these types of things. Accusations against Jews were in Christian Europe in the folklore, right? And then they filtered through into modern, shall we say, more modern anti-Semitism. Those didn't really happen in the Islamic world, those types of criticisms. Generally, as Zionism expands and as more Jews are brought to Palestine before the creation of the State of Israel, a lot of, especially the Ottoman world, seems to have received a lot of this Christian anti-Semitism or European anti-Semitism, a lot of it based on folklore, myths, and stories from Christian Europe. And these are, and a lot of them really just complete and utter nonsense. And so what happens, though, unfortunately, is that for political reasons, a lot of the Ottoman areas start to propagate this, and it becomes almost mainstream within a lot of these Muslim areas. However, the ideas themselves, and many scholars have written about this recently, is that the ideas themselves don't really come from Islam at all. They don't really come from Muslim lands. They're sort of imported. And even if one goes back to the historical, shall we say, like I was saying about the theological representation of Jews as negative within Islam, many of those come from Israeliyat, from converted Christians to Islam. And those converted Christians to Islam brought with them a bit of baggage, a bit of anti-Jewish baggage, and that's why also, if you do find traces within classical Islamic literature, oftentimes you can actually still trace it back to something that was brought within Islam rather than coming from within.
So that's very interesting. And then we know in the Christian tradition, what then happened was the Zionism project, and then moving into and in the 20th century, actually there was, and people say there's signs of that, for example, in the way Muslims are being talked about in India and things like that. So the literature was there, people were almost being sold that idea, and then actually the Nazis were the ones who put it into place, but actually a lot of people didn't like Jews anyway. Or in the populace, there was those opinions. Around that time in the 20th century, looking at some Muslim areas, so we're talking about, for example, the Dönmeh in Mustafa Kemal. What is that story, if you can tell us, and does it have historical legitimacy?
Okay, so the Dönmeh is very interesting. So they're Sabbateans, they're called, because there was an individual called Sabbatai Zevi who was a Jewish person in the Ottoman Empire, late Ottoman Empire, and essentially he claims to be the Messiah. So as I was saying earlier about Christians, so Christians did away with the old law. That is exactly what Sabbataians also believed in. So in essence, the Torah no longer stands. This is the Messiah, and he is going to send the Israelites back to their promised land. That is the role of the Messiah. And I mean, he had a widespread popularity among Jews, and I'm talking including there's letters from European Jews that they're writing to him, and they're getting ready for the end of times, and people, his popularity is exploding really throughout the world. And so what he does is he leads a group of people all the way to Constantinople, a group of Jews, and they march to Constantinople, and it starts to get bigger and bigger, and it's a massive group of people. They go to Constantinople, and Sabbatai Zevi goes inside and speaks to the Sultan. And after there's some negotiation, and a bit of time, people are waiting outside, and he comes back out with an imama on, with a turban on. It says, I'm Muhammad and I'm Muslim. And so according to Judaism, you must follow the Messiah, right? And the Messiah will do away with the old covenant and may come up with a new covenant, right? And so if the new covenant is Islam, many of Sabbataians decided, okay, well, we have to become Muslim according to Judaism now.
Is it when he says I'm Muhammad, as in he's changed his name to Muhammad, or he's saying I'm Muhammad as in the Prophet?
No, he changed his name to
He
Muhammad.
changed his name to Muhammad, okay.
Yeah. So, probably there was some political pressure behind closed doors and that type of thing in order to make it go away. But Sabbatai Zevi, for all intents and purposes, probably does continue practicing Judaism in secret. And so what happens is Sabbataians are what are known as crypto Jews, or people who outwardly do not profess that they're Jews, but secretly, and he was a Kabbalist as well. So Kabbalah is sort of similar to how we have Sufism in Islam. There's some aspects which are sort of from within the tradition, but there are other aspects which are sort of more mystical and more interested in unorthodox practices. So Sabbatai Zevi he's a deep Kabbalist, and he carries on teaching and learning, and so the group is also linked to Kabbalah a bit, so it's even more mysterious in a way, and no one can really put their fingers on who these people are and what they actually believe in. But the group becomes known as the Dönmeh in Turkey, and in Ottoman Empire and in Turkey. And you can go and see their graves in Istanbul. They have a very big graveyard there, and for example, they show pictures of the deceased. So there are some very outward differences, shall we say, between the Dönmeh and Muslims when it came to practices, but at the same time, they were part of Turkish society, and they got on with it. And it's not like Turkish society was any stranger to sort of unorthodox or heterodox beliefs. There's the Alevis, for example, form a massive population in Turkey, who are not Sunni at all, really, in their creed. So it was just a group within the group, and then of course there were a lot of Jews who actual practicing Orthodox Jews, who had also gone there from Spain, and a native population in Turkey as well since the Roman times, actually, in Istanbul. So Jews were always apart. However, because of the secrecy or the mystery surrounding the Dönmeh, unfortunately, it led to a lot of conjecture by a lot of the Turkish population, especially the Muslim Turkish population, who said that they were linked them to all sorts of groups, including the Freemasons and other groups like that, and spreading information like, for example, Mustafa Kemal was a Dönmeh. As far as I know, he wasn't. As far as I know, he went to a school for Dönmeh, but just because of that association, because there's so all the mystery behind it and that sort of thing, it led to the proliferation of all sorts of rumors about Mustafa Kemal and all sorts of people who were in the Turkish Republic. And it continues to be almost it continues to be used negatively in Turkey, and you could see that as a facet of anti-Semitism. You can see that as but also it's linked to the whole mystique, shall we say, behind the group.
And they're still, so they still have their schools and things like that today?
Yeah, there are some, but as time goes on, they're sort of very much on the decline. Yeah.
So that's specific to Turkey, and actually that's a very interesting story. Is this linked to, a lot of times when you talk about, there's modern tropes, so to speak. So there's tropes about Kabbalah being, I think people talk about it as a form of magic or something like that. And yes, Freemasons often associated with Judaism or Jews, which actually Freemasons are, there's no religion. I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I think one of the Ottoman caliphs was actually a Freemason.
Yeah, so not just Ottoman Caliph, but actually a lot of Christian and Muslim leaders got involved because they wanted to know what the group was all about and what they're doing. Napoleon, for example, is a very famous Freemason. Prince Philip. So many people they get involved within the group just to sort of know, what this group is doing. Are some of the stories true and that type of thing. I don't know personally, of course, but I'm sure I'm sure there are people who are much more knowledgeable about Freemasonry than I am. But as far as I know, it's you just have to believe in God, and that's sort of the entry requirement. As long as you're recommended by someone who is within the Masonic Lodge, then you sort of get involved. So yeah, I mean it's very common in Christian countries, and yeah, like you say, one of the Ottoman caliphs was involved in the Freemasonry. Yeah.
Okay, so now we're going on along the 20th century to the creation of the State of Israel. So actually, there's a build-up in British Palestine or British Mandate Palestine, and there's acts of terrorism, commissioners, things like that, getting attacked. Even British officials getting attacked by Jewish terrorist groups. And then there's the State of Israel and the first Nakba, the first catastrophe where so many Muslims or so many Palestinians, actually, not just Muslim, get displaced. What happens to Jews living around? So there's Jewish communities. We talked about the one in Turkey, Morocco, Iran. Are there anywhere else? And then what happens to these communities in terms of how they view themselves as citizens of their respective countries and also as Jews? Um,
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So what happens, if I could really paint it with a general brush here, what happens is there is, especially in the Arab countries in North Africa and those areas, a lot of Arab politicians, shall we say, or a lot of Muslim politicians, in reaction to the state of Israel and the events surrounding it, start to alienate the Jewish population as a sort of reaction to the political atmosphere. And so, for example, in France, because it was under French control at the time, all Jews actually were allowed to move to France if they wished. Whereas the Muslims, it wasn't such a clear-cut deal, shall we say. But so, that type of thing occurred where third-party countries got involved and a lot of Jews moved out of Muslim countries to other countries like the US or France or Britain or other such countries. And a lot of them remained and then moved to Israel. And that's essentially what happened if you could really boil it down to its very basics. And I would also say that is the juncture at which Muslim-Jewish relations breaks down within Muslim countries. That is the juncture of where there's serious. I mean, that's why now, for instance, there in many Muslim countries we don't see a sizable Jewish minority anymore, which used to be the case, and it's because of that, and it's because of politics, essentially.
Yeah, so it's not that, so there was nothing anti-Semitic, and in fact, you didn't have any pogroms or anything in Muslim countries, and you still don't. But actually, the breakdown in relations is very much post 1948. So most of these Jews, did they? I mean, I know that there was a big Jewish community in Karachi, for example. In Morocco, we can visit like the old synagogues and stuff, which are virtually defunct now, just maintained. But it's a modern phenomenon with politics, but actually we hear some anti-Semitic tropes now being peddled by Muslims, prominent ones sometimes, including things like Holocaust denial, which is a modern phenomenon, or some of the other tropes, and we talked about some of them around Kabbalah and things like, and Freemasons and things like that. Is it that Christian anti-Semitic tropes are being imported and then used by, we can say, politically savvy or politically expedient Muslims?
Yes, I wouldn't sort of absolve Muslims completely necessarily in what's going on. It's very easy to say, oh, it came from Christian Europe, it went into the Islamic world, and that's why, and the Muslims were none the wiser. I think that's an oversimplification. I said it in a way to sort of give a general historical overview of the main ideas, but then they do start to develop within Muslim countries, and it's Muslims who really are building upon this, and other groups as well who are building upon this, these ideas. So it's not, shall we say, I mean, I make no apology for Muslim especially modern Muslim anti-Semitism, which does exist in places like the Arab world. Less so in countries like you mentioned, Karachi, for example. Pakistan has little to no Jewish population. I think it has no Jewish population at the moment. Countries like Afghanistan had, famously, the last Jew was one man remaining in the country, and so for a lot of the Muslim world, Jews are not really a relevant group, really, to even talk about or use in political ways, shall we say. However, in others they are. However, in most Muslim countries, really, if there is any discourse about Jews, it's mainly pertaining to the state of Israel, and so it's political discourse, and like you say, it's used for political aims, and by the same token, okay, this anti-Semitism perhaps does exist, but also we have very strong voices now within the Muslim communities throughout the world, explaining to Muslims that it's not within our religion, for instance, to be anti-Semitic, and it's not something that is recommended within Islam. It's not something that one should do. It's not something that one should identify as. And a lot of Muslim clerics have taken that upon themselves to explain that. For example, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya is doing great work right now to sort of combat a lot of the negative stereotypes that we have in the Muslim world.
Yeah, and I think so there's examples of Muslim scholars actually trying to bridge that gap. There's also been some very viral videos of rabbis with positive opinions on Islam, and I think some of it is actually, are they from specific sects and there's a general friendliness in certain sects, or is it general? And also, what do they say, especially with regards to the prophethood of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam?
Yeah, so we have the ones that I've heard of, the rabbis that I've heard of that talk positively about Islam tend to be Orthodox rabbis. So Orthodox rabbis, generally the way that they talk positively about Islam is they're comparing it to Christianity. And so if you look from a historical perspective, for instance, generally speaking, Jews were treated better in Muslim lands. But then if you go more towards Aqidah and more towards creed, right? Muslims are much closer to Jews when it comes to creed, but with both religions sharing a Unitarian God, not a Trinitarian God, for instance, like in Christianity. And actually, a Trinitarian God would render that group no longer under the previous covenant or the Noahide covenant. So there's the Beni Noach, who are the children of Noah. And within Judaism, the Beni Noach have their own covenant with God, and they will be rewarded by God. And this includes people who believe in one God, a Unitarian God, and follow their laws or their covenants. So according to Orthodox Judaism, Muslims are Beni Noach, but Christians aren't. because of the depictions of Jesus and considering Jesus as God. And to such an extent, actually, in Orthodox Judaism, it's impermissible to walk into a church for a religious Jew. However, it's completely permissible to walk into a mosque. And that type of thing is being said now by many Orthodox rabbis throughout the world. And also there's the ultra-Orthodox Jews. And the ultra-Orthodox Jews perhaps have a different reason for speaking highly, shall we say, of Muslims. And that reason is that ultra-Orthodox Jews reject the premise of Israel. Many of them reject the premise of Israel, claiming that we're currently living in the divine exile, and that the Messiah is the one who has to bring people back to the land. Most Orthodox Jews now accept the reality of Israel as a Jewish state, but some ultra-Orthodox Jews still denounce Israel, shall we say. And because of that, a lot of ultra-Orthodox Jews try and speak highly of Islam and Muslims to foster dialogue, because they are also, it's their belief really to be against the state of Israel. And this was common in the beginning of the state of Israel, actually. And a lot of Jewish politicians, a lot of Israeli politicians, were very outspoken against the ultra-Orthodox groups. However, more recently, it sort of died down.
And it's because both those communities are died down, or kind of it's just that kind of it's become more mainstream to be pro-Israel in the Jewish community.
Yes, it's become the accepted norm. It's become the political reality. It's become expedient, and it's the political reality, I would say.
Okay, that's very interesting. I think what we tried to do here was also, I think we often focus on actually the wars element. So everyone talks about the few wars. So 1948, the first catastrophe, then the Suez Crisis in the 50s, and then 1967, 1971, and then kind of talking about the late 90s and the kind of the the protest movements following that, and then the invasions back and forth. And I think what we were able to do today was go a little bit off that and actually think about how's it affected the communities and the people around back and forth. So I think that was quite interesting. And it remains interesting to see how that relationship evolves. When I think it's, the two closest faiths in terms of Judeo-Christian and Islamic is the two monotheistic Abrahamic faiths. So I think that was very interesting. In terms of closing, I think if you give us a quick summary, because we've had 2 episodes, so a quick maybe 60-second summary of the don't worry, I won't time you or anything, but just like kind of a wrap up of if we look at it from an overview perspective of everything we've talked about in the past probably 90 odd minutes, of what is the relationship between Jews and Islam and how it's been and how it's evolved to come to where we are today.
Yeah, sure. It might be a bit longer than 60 seconds, but I'll try to keep within. So there's a couple of articles that I've written actually on this that I would briefly refer to. One is Islam and Judaism, religious attitudes and identities in the Medinan era. And this article, it's a little bit long, but it's open access, so people can access this free and at home. And that article talks about Medina and how Muslims and Jews had slightly better religious attitudes about one another than what is developed in later history. And that's about early Medina. Now, in late Medina, in the Prophet's lifetime, there's a political disturbance, and it leads to more confrontational rhetoric from both sides. After that, you see throughout Muslim-Jewish relations, whenever there's a political disturbance, then Muslim-Jewish relations seem to crumble. And I've also written an article on this called Muslim-Jewish harmony a politically contingent reality. There's also open access, and you can access that from home. And essentially, what you see throughout Islamic history is exactly that: is whenever it's politically expedient, generally relations are pretty good. However, whenever there's serious political disturbance, there's a breakdown in relations between Muslims and Jews. Oftentimes, religious rhetoric is used while the breakdown is occurring, but it's not religiously inspired. It's politically inspired, and it's political causes really for these breakdown in relations. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so that's quite interesting how it comes down to, and there's a notion that Muslims and Jews have been at each other's throats for thousands of years, and I think we've proven quite conclusively that that's not the case, and I don't think anyone who is honest or serious about their scholarship would say that. So Jazakallah khair for your time, really appreciate that, and I think that was quite interesting, especially in terms of the new movements, the discussions we did about the medieval era, and especially in the 20th century, and especially the group called the Dönmeh. I think that'll be very interesting for our viewers. If you've got any questions or feedback to lay out, or further questions, we can reach out to the speaker on, or other speakers you want to recommend, you can email us on islamthroughtheages at gmail.com. We also shared, I think it was your Twitter.
Probably not my Twitter,
No.
probably my email or LinkedIn.
Yeah. So your LinkedIn primarily. So Mohammed Ahmed on LinkedIn, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes as well if people want to interact directly with you. Have you got any publications people can follow up on?
So the articles that I mentioned, and there are some other ones forthcoming. Yeah.
Okay, and I think some of our listeners might also be interested in your actual dissertation when you finish it and publish it, including myself. So we'll get around to that, and I'm sure you'll post it on your LinkedIn when it's ready.
Absolutely.
So yeah, Jazakallah khair for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, inshallah, and we definitely look forward to potentially doing a follow-up with you at some point, whether on this topic or something else in your areas of expertise.
Inshallah. Sounds very good. And thank you all for listening. Thank you.
Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa barakatuh.
Wa rahmatullah.